Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 16 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is Jaycee Dugard. Before I get into the episode, one thing, if you hear a little bit of rainfall in the background, I'm currently recording this in a trailer in my parents' driveway. So there might be a little bit of rainfall that you'll hear just kind of slightly in the background, but I don't think it'll be anything too severe. Another thing I want to talk about is that this episode is a little disturbing. There's some info in it that's really dark. And I don't think that this is going to be an episode that is for younger listeners. I don't think this is an episode that is going to be for a lot of people, if I'm being honest. There are a lot of topics in this that are really dark and kind of sadistic and twisted. So unfortunately, that is the episode that we have today. So just a disclaimer, there's some sexual assault, there's some child brutality things in it, and I just want to give everyone a heads up and a disclaimer that this episode might not be for everybody, and that is totally okay. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. So Jaycee Dugard, if for those of you that are some older listeners of mine, you might remember when this case happened, and sort of remember the impact that it had on the community. Jaycee Dugard was an 11-year-old girl that got kidnapped, raped, and kept against her will for about 18 years. She was kept there by Phillip and Nancy Garrido, who met while Garrido was in prison. He was a previous offender. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the Garridos and their history, and then we're going to get into Jaycee and her history, and then talk a little bit about what actually happened. But first, let's start with a little bit of background, because Phillip and Nancy are much older than Jaycee, obviously. Phillip and Nancy met while Phillip was in prison at Leavenworth. He was serving a 50-year federal sentence for kidnapping and raping a 25-year-old woman named Catherine Calloway. She was kidnapped and taken to a warehouse in Reno, Nevada, but he kidnapped her in South Lake Tahoe, California. And that is important because that is where Jaycee Dugard was also taken from. There, Garrido raped her for about 5.5 hours until a policeman was driving by and he noticed that there was a car parked outside the warehouse unit. And when he started to go up and inspect it, he noticed a broken lock on the door. He knocked on the warehouse door and he was greeted by Garrido, who seemed a little frazzled, but overall pretty on top of his game, until Calloway stumbled out asking for help and was bleeding and beaten, and the whole scene started to make sense, and Phillip was promptly arrested and charged and then convicted on June 30th, 1977. Nancy Garrido was visiting her uncle in prison when she met Phillip, and they were married on October 5th, 1981, at the ages of 30 for Phillip and 25 for Nancy, respectively. On January 22nd, 1988, he got transferred to Nevada State Prison, where he served 7 months of a 5 years to life sentence. Then he was transferred to federal parole officers in Contra Costa on August 26th, 1988, and the Garridos lived in Antioch with his elderly mother, who was suffering, unfortunately, from dementia, and so was not fully really aware of much of what was going on. He was monitored very closely, and at one point he even had to wear one of those house restraint, like ankle trackers, so he couldn't go too far in any direction. He was eventually released, and in September of 1990, he kidnapped Dugard with the help of his wife. So that's a little bit of background on Garrido. Another thing to note is that there were other cases against him as far as sexual misconduct with 13-year-olds and 14-year-old girls. He had a couple rape charges while this case was going on where he was serving. They stated that he was like schizophrenic and he had all these mental problems. Like he wasn't really fully there. And he was an avid drug user. He loved using methamphetamines, and this normally was what gave him these sadistic sexual tendencies and ideas. And they determined that he felt that the community had kind of like left him in the dust, as far as his sort of sexual sadism went. Like, he never really got help for it, even though they had determined that he definitely needed help for it, which I think was just a really stupid choice. So as far as background on them, Nancy obviously has a lot of problems to be with someone like that. But as far as Phillip, I think he's just a very manipulative, sadistic man that he really knows how to play the game, and he knows how to get people to do what he wants them to do. And so I think you'll see how that plays into everything with Jaycee. So getting into the actual case, this was a cold case for a while. Nobody could figure out what happened. A bunch of dead ends. The community didn't really know what was going on. But what happened was, and we know Dugard survived, as another thing. She has an autobiography that I'm going to talk about. She has a bunch of stuff that she's written. She is alive. And so we know what happened for sure because she recounted the events. She was age 11, and she was in 5th grade and was an extremely, extremely shy girl. She was not very outspoken. She was not outgoing, very to herself. And she walked to the bus stop every single day. She walked up a hill against traffic to get to the bus stop every day. When she was walking up the hill, she saw this car passing by, and she was a very polite but shy girl, so she thought maybe they're going to ask for directions. Let me help them out. When Garrido rolled the window down, he shot her with a stun gun. She was shocked, and then Nancy Garrido pulled her into the car, and they started to drive away. She got dragged in through the window, and her stepfather witnessed the entire thing happen. He watched his daughter get taken into the car, but there was no car for him to get in, so he got on a bicycle and started chasing the car. But eventually, obviously, a car is faster than a man on a bike, and he lost track of them. He was unable to keep up with the car, which I just think is devastating. But then what's even worse is that he was one of the initial suspects in the case. They thought that some of the suspects would be either Dugard himself, the father, or it would be the stepfather, Carl Probin. The biological father's name was Ken Slayton. Slayton was unaware that he had a biological child when they talked to him, and they were like, why would you want to, see Jaycee and whatever? And he was like, I don't have a kid. It was kind of like a fling with his mom that sort of led to the kid, and he was completely unaware that he had even had, fathered a child in any way. And Probin passed many different polygraph tests, many different interviews, all sorts of things, and they sort of cleared him from the case and were like, there's no way he would have done this to his daughter. They weren't necessarily close in relationships. Everybody kind of recounted that they weren't the closest of families, but there was no way he would have been able to do that sort of thing. And people saw him chasing, there were accounts of him chasing the car and whatever. So there's no way that he would have been able to do it. The drive from South Lake Tahoe, where he kidnapped her, to his house in Antioch is about a 3-hour drive if you're going pretty fast. So Nancy most likely was the one that was holding Jaycee down. And when they had got there, Jaycee had been stripped all the way down. The only thing that she had on her was a tiny butterfly ring that she had hid from them and then managed to keep with her for the entire 18 years of her captivity. When they got to the house, they covered her head with a blanket, and they ushered her into a soundproofed shed in the backyard, so she couldn't see where she was. She didn't know. He did not rape her for an entire week of her being locked up, which is a very interesting thing to note. This was definitely a power play on his part of saying, I own you, I control you. He started by just, bringing her milkshakes and food and talking with her. He convinced her that if she tried to leave, there were these Doberman pincers that were trained to attack her. He left her naked and locked up in the shed, and after a week of captivity, he raped her for the first time, um, and sort of just left this 11-year-old girl, like, bloody and bruised, naked, alone in a soundproofed shed where nobody could see her or hear her. When they initially got there, he also made her shower with her, or with him, rather, while wearing the handcuffs, which is something that is also probably a power play. And for Jaycee, like, this is the first time that she's seen a man naked at all. So to sort of see this man that's kidnapped you and then be forced to sort of shower with him, and that, like, it's a lot to sort of take in when you're that young, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. She recounts that she kept saying, like, my parents can't pay for bail. They really can't do it. And they kept trying to convince her that her parents didn't care. They weren't even looking for her. That sort of thing. After about a month and a half of captivity, he moved her to a larger shed that had a big bed in it that she was handcuffed to. And for a while, he would provide TV, but there were no news channels that were hooked up to the TV. So she couldn't see that there was this whole nationwide search for her. And they kept convincing her that nobody even cared that she was gone, and her family abandoned her. He gave her a bucket that she could relieve herself in. And he ended up telling her that she had been taken because society had ignored his sexual issues, and this was the way that he was going to fix them. So she was doing a service to him by being in captivity with him. So he was trying to convince her that all of his problems were ignored, and the only way to fix it was by having her. So if she left, he would just go get another girl. So this is another tactic that is really common. These kidnapping cases are very uncommon. You do not see a lot of these happen because it takes so much premeditation, and it takes so much time and effort from the captor to keep someone like this locked up for that long. So you don't really see a lot of cases like this, but in the cases that you see, this is one of the super common tactics that you will see, is that they will say that, well, if you leave, I'll just go get another girl. So you have to be the one you have to make the sacrifice to help me. This is helping me. You have to help me. So what happens is Stockholm Syndrome starts to creep in, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it starts to creep in where you almost feel empathetic towards your captor, and you start to feel like, I have to do this to help this person. I'm the one that has to do it. Like, I don't wish this upon anybody else, and therefore I can't escape. I can't leave, which is normally when they end up moving up into, like, living in the house with them and basically becoming like a second wife. That he can do whatever he wants to because she feels that she is helping society by putting up with his shit. As far as other things that he did to her, he would tell her that he had these voices that were coming from the walls, and that he was a servant that was chosen by God. He became a very religious man, which is also a really horrifying thing, that he was like, I'm a servant of God, but also let me rape this 11-year-old girl. Like, those things don't really go together. So I'm not entirely sure how he worked that in his brain. He usually did all these things of talking to her and things like that when he was on his highs, which he would call runs, when he was on his runs, which is he would get high on methamphetamines. And normally at the end of his runs, he would realize that what he was doing was bad, and he would sob and cry and apologize to her profusely, and then start to threaten her, telling her that he would sell her to people that would end up keeping her in a cage for the rest of her life. They renamed her Alyssa, Allissa, and she was not allowed to speak or write her own name. They at one point gave her a journal that she could jot her thoughts down in, until they realized that she was writing her original name in the journal. And then they removed the journal and punished her, and she's not allowed to state her own name. She is not allowed to write her own name. Her name was now Alyssa, fully changed. 7 months into captivity, she finally met Nancy officially. She brought her chocolate milk and a stuffed animal, and started crying and apologizing her, telling her that she was so sorry that this had happened to her. She couldn't believe that this is what was going to be her fate. But you start to realize, and Dugard started to realize this as well, Nancy was the big manipulator. You see a lot of what Phillip is doing is very like basic kidnapper to kidnapped person tactics to sort of keep them trapped. But Nancy really tried to win over the aspect of, you're a little girl and you need a mother figure right now. And I'm going to be that mother figure and then also use it against you later when you try to do literally anything at all. So you see that like Nancy actually later filled in. Garrido had to go back to prison because he failed a drug test. And Nancy was the one that ended up filling in for him and like beating her and keeping her down and sort of taking over the captor cap. She took on the captor cap. They never let Jaycee see a doctor or a dentist, despite being pregnant twice, and giving birth twice. She never saw a doctor. The first time she got pregnant was at 13. It was almost 3 years into her captivity. They taught her about what sex and pregnancy was through television. She kind of had to figure it out for herself based on the things she was seeing on TV. And then they made her watch videos of live childbirth so that she could understand that this is what was going to happen to her. She had her first child at 14 and survived, and she had her second child at 17 and survived. At one point, a neighbor boy saw her, and so Garrido ended up building a 6 to 8 foot tall wooden fence around the backyard. But then he also built a tent outdoors that Dugard was allowed to be in. So now she was no longer confined to the shed. She could wander throughout the backyard because he knew that she was not going to go anywhere because he'd had her locked up for 4 or 5 years and knew that he had her under his thumb. And so a lot of people might be like, well, this is a really stupid decision on his part to let her roam out in the backyard. But she was trapped for 18 years. So within, 4 years, he had her so whipped into shape that there was no way she could have left. There was no mental way that she could have forced herself to leave. She was stuck. She felt trapped, and he knew that. So he let her have outdoor time. She would plant a lot of flowers. She would garden. And she ended up homeschooling her children, which were both young girls, which is an unfortunate circumstance, especially given where they were born. Garrido made Dugard tell her children that she was just their older sister and that Nancy was everybody's mother. So they didn't want the kids to know that she had given birth to them. He wanted them to think that Nancy was the mom of all 3 of them, which is probably a smart tactic on his part, because they wouldn't question that. Mom, dad, 3 daughters, like the kids aren't really going to question that. So he made Jaycee do that, and she did it willingly. He also owned a print shop. That was his main business to sort of keep up funds. And he actually had Dugard become a graphic artist in the print shop. People recall her doing amazing work, talking to her on the phone. She was very polite. She said her name was Alyssa. Nobody ever really questioned it. She never sounded scared. She never hinted that she wanted to run away. And she admits, I never made any indication that anything was wrong because I couldn't go anywhere. I was stuck. There was nowhere for me to go. She now had access to a phone. She had access to a work email. She would answer the front door of the house and let people in, and she would never try to run away or escape. Now, a lot of you that are listening are like, what a dumb bitch. But you have to consider the circumstances that she's in. She's been told since age 11, which are, 11 to 14 is a very formative time of your life. And to be told that your family abandoned you, Nobody's looking for you. And she hasn't seen the news or anything. So she has no idea that there is this huge national, local coverage of her going missing, and that there's this group of people that are trying to find her still. And like the town is like painted in pink ribbons. Like nobody knows that. She doesn't know that because she's been locked up and convinced that that's not the case. She's been raped and beaten. She's given birth to 2 children. By age 18, she's given birth to 2 children and has already been in captivity for 7 years. Like, that really takes a toll on you, especially if he's also telling her, like, you're helping me, you're saving society by helping me. Like, when you're that young and you're like, yes, I'm doing what's right for the people, I'm doing something that's helping people, you're going to do it. So it's almost like she doesn't want to leave. She does come out in an interview later and says that the fact that people think that she was ever in love with him and had full-blown Stockholm syndrome is really sickening to herself. She's like, I would never, ever fall in love with a man like that. But I felt empathy for him. I was with him for 18 years, you know? You start to feel for somebody like that, especially when you're a captive for that long. Like, I don't know. You don't know what it's like to sort of be in that situation until you're in it. And I hope that nobody ever experiences a situation like that ever again. But for those of you saying, oh, she's so dumb, she should have run away, like, you're not there and you're not in her brain. There's a lot of like psychological stuff that goes on behind the scenes that you might not be aware of. It's a really cool thing to research in your spare time. It's really fascinating. As far as the police efforts, there were a couple missed rescue opportunities, including one where 911 was called about children and tents in the backyard of Garrido's house. They said that they saw 2 young children and a girl that looked younger in the backyard with tents and sheds, and the police didn't think to check his backyard. Because if they would have just checked his backyard, like the 911 call said, they would have found Dugard and the children, which is against his parole. So, I'm just intrigued as to why the officer did not think to check the backyard. Seems like something that he overlooked quite a bit. During everything that was happening, I've mentioned it a couple times, but there was local and national media coverage of Dugard's disappearance. It was all over the news. Everybody knew what was going on. Due to her favorite color being pink, the town was covered in these pink ribbons. Everybody wore them in support of the search efforts of Jaycee. There were thousands of flyers that were plastered up and sent to businesses across the USA. And Dugard's mother founded the Jaycee's Hope group, which directed volunteer and fundraising in order to pay for all the posters and the ribbons and the coverage that was going on everywhere. They held candlelight vigils and these child safety awareness events that sort of kept Jaycee at the forefront of everyone's mind, even though she was nowhere to be found and all the leads were leading nowhere. Her mother really kept her. The reason that this was such a big case was because her mother made such a big deal and made this group and all these advocates, and her whole life became devoted to Jaycee, despite Jaycee not even being there. So all the media coverage and stuff, like, it died down, sure, but she was still on the forefront of everybody's mind. Where is she? What happened to her? And for a while, it was a cold case. So people were looking at it like, this is such a fascinating cold case. What happened to this girl? Because normally what you're told is that after the first 24 to 48 hours of a child being gone, they're usually dead. So the fact that they couldn't find a body anywhere and nobody knew where she was fascinating. So it became this really, really big thing across the country. And then the huge mistake happened. On August 24th, 2009, Garrido visited University of California, Berkeley, with Dugard's 2 daughters because he wanted to hold an event on campus for God's desire, quote unquote, which is his sort of religious group of sorts. Also, earlier that day, he went to the FBI and sort of left a message that was like, I've figured out how to cure people with this, terrible, awful sexual disease. I figured it out. And he put like basically a manifesto down that was like, this is how we have to do it. He spoke with the special events manager, whose name was Lisa Campbell. And Lisa Campbell reported that his behaviors were very erratic. The girls looked super pale. They looked a little too submissive. The whole situation seemed suspect. It seemed off. Nobody was really believing that he was sort of not an abusive person to them. Like, they were so pale. She was like, it looked like they hadn't been outside. So she said, why don't you come back the next day? I can have an appointment for you on the following day at 2 p.m. He said, sure, that sounds like a plan. I'll be back tomorrow. So once he left, she reported all of this to Officer Allie Jacobs, who ran a background check on him, and found out all of the offenses that he had done in the past, and that, number one, he was just breaking parole by leaving to go to that campus. It was outside of the range that he was allowed to drive to. And number two, he shouldn't be in contact with girls that are that young. So, problems 1 and 2 there. When Garrido came back for his appointment the next day, Officer Jacobs sat in on it, and immediately after, she phoned the parole office to get him arrested for his violations. He was then arrested and then returned, and then he was told to come in the next day. So he brought his wife, Dugard, and the girls, where they were all separated the following day to sort of be questioned separately about, who they were, why they were there. Jaycee maintained this false identity as Alyssa. She even went so far as to tell people that she was a beaten wife from Michigan and that she was just here to escape, and he's a changed man, he's a kind man, he treats me so right, blah, 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 blah. I escaped here barely with my life, and he's been so helpful. She didn't start to admit who she was until Garrido himself was like, I kidnapped Jaycee Dugard, and I've been hiding her in my shed. And then she was like, by the way, I'm Jaycee Dugard. And so a lot of people think that she sort of succumbed to Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome is defined as, quote, feelings of trust or affection felt in many cases of kidnapping or hostage taking by a victim towards a captor, unquote. A lot of people think that she got to this point where she was in love with him, and that's why she would defend him. And she came out in an interview later and said, the fact that people think that is disgusting. I would never fall in love with a man like that. I had no choice. I was trying to save my own life, and I was afraid that if I ratted him out, told them who I was, and they did not arrest him and keep him there, I would be killed and my children would be taken away from me. She's like, I was doing what I had to do to survive. It's not about my feelings towards him or anything. I'm simply trying to survive. She then was able to sort of escape because they arrested him immediately. They had a confession. They had her, which is a really big, thing. They searched his house. They found everything they needed to find. She ended up writing a memoir. It's titled A Stolen Life, a memoir. It was published on July 12th, 2011. And she's been a super huge advocate of women's rights and child safety awareness and stuff like that ever since then. She really didn't let what had happened to her sort of keep her in a dark place. I'm sure she struggles with things as we all do. Her a little bit more than others. But she really has been just a bright light in sort of teaching people that you need to be so careful, almost like a cautionary tale sort of thing. I'm not going to talk about the case. I'm not going to talk about the things that are said in court or anything like that. I don't think it really adds much to this particular episode, because clearly we know from his previous offenses what his issues are. We know what's going on with him. We know that he was arrested and put in prison. Same with Nancy. And it was pretty apparent that what they were doing was wrong. There was no real, like, ifs, ands, or buts. Like, we kind of knew that they were at fault here. So that's all I really have today for this episode. I know that that's dark. It's kind of a dark true crime topic. It's not a really bright one, but I think it's really important to note that Jaycee Dugard experienced something so horrible and traumatic, and she came out of it not only with 2 children that she had raised and educated herself, but she came out of it with a book, and she holds all these events for child safety, and she's such a huge advocate of making sure that your kids are safe and that they know what's going on in the world and that they themselves get educated. Like, she is such a bright woman coming out of such a dark place. And I think it's really important to note that you can go through something terrible and traumatic, and you can come out on the other side and help people that were in a situation like yours. You can help people that are in a similar mindset to you, that went through something that's horrible, and you can try to help them versus sort of staying put in what you went through. And I'm a huge person that suffers with, mental illness and things like that. And I know that it's hard to pull yourself out of that. And it's hard to sort of come from your dark place and try to make something bright and light. But if Jaycee can do it, after 18 years of abuse, rape, childbirth, mental abuse, like all of these things, like, and she comes out of it and is like, I'm a person and here's what I have to say, then I think anybody can come through. And I know we're all different, and she is such a strong person, and not everybody can be as strong as that. But I think if we all aspire to be at that level, at that strength of Jaycee, I think that it'll help us all a lot. And I'm sure that she asks for help a lot, and that's something that's acceptable too. This has just turned into a PSA. Ask for help if you're sad or in a dark place, because there are people out there that are definitely going to want to help you. Even if you don't think they will, and it'll be great. So anyway, on a brighter note, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to message me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is @whispersfrombelow. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. Or shoot me an email at whispersfrombelow@gmail.com. No spaces, no underscores, no capitals, no nothing. I'm currently still trying to work on getting that website up and running. If I can manage to get that website up and running, there will be a little section where you can send me comments directly through there, which will be super cool. Please share this podcast if you like it. That's the number one thing I can ask from you guys right now, is just sharing, whether it be through word of mouth or on social media. I know a couple people have put it on their stories that they love my podcast, and I've gotten a couple more listens from that, and it is so appreciated. I really love doing this every week. I'm doing it twice a week now, for those of you that don't know. During quarantine, I'm going to be uploading Mondays at 8 a.m. and Thursdays at 8 a.m. So you'll get 2 episodes a week. But I'm really, really loving doing this, and I think that a lot of you guys are really loving it too. And in order for me to keep pumping out great content for you guys and keep putting out the things that you want to hear, I need your guys' help, and I need more support. So the more that you guys can share this podcast, it doesn't have to be on social media if that makes you uncomfortable. Just share by word of mouth. Even just if everybody that listens to this shared it with one person, that literally doubles the amount of listeners that I have. And it would be absolutely amazing if you guys could do that. Watch out for some merch prototypes that are going to be going up on the Whispers From Below Instagram pretty soon. Keep your eyes peeled for that. And remember, kidnapping is not it, sis. You can come out of any dark place if you really try. And please stay safe and wash your hands and be clean.